In today's video, we are going to go over the top questions that we get about TDIU. My name is Greg. I'm an Air Force veteran turned VA disability lawyer.
My name is Victoria Rada, and like Greg said, we get a lot of questions about TDIU, sort of the whole spectrum. A lot of people that misunderstand what TDIU even is, and then very nuanced specific questions about what they're allowed to earn and different types of employment. So we are going to just jump right in. I'm going to stand in the shoes of the veteran and ask the questions and have you answer them, Greg. So I want to start with just an explanation of TDIU and what it is, because a lot of people think that it is a specific benefit that you can apply for, almost like as if TDIU is the ailment itself. So just start there.
Yeah, so in most simplest forms, TDIU is a rating, and it is the highest rating, meaning that it pays at the 100% payment rate. But TDIU stands for a total disability rating based on individual unemployability, and VA will give you TDIU when you are unable to work due to your service-connected disabilities. And so it's a mechanism whereby if a veteran, has a combined rating of 80% and their disabilities make them unable to work, the VA understands, that they have total occupational impairment and therefore should be receiving the 100% payment rate. And so TDIU is a way to get paid at the 100% payment rate when your combined rating is less than 100%.
So just starting there, for all the folks that call and say they have TDIU and they want to make a claim for it. TDIU is a rating. So you would have something else going on. You would have symptoms from some other injury or illness. And because of that, you are unable to work. And because you are unable to work, you are requesting a rating of TDIU.
Correct.
And the other thing I want you to address before we get into the more specific questions is a lot of people think that they are prohibited from going after TDIU because they only have 30% rating, or they have four, low ratings. One's 20%, one's 10, and then two other 10, something like that. And I want to talk about the actual requirements needed to be eligible to apply for TDIU.
The VA, if you go to their website, like I've pulled up here, you'll see that they explain, am I eligible for this benefit from VA? And it must be true that you can't hold down a steady job. And then you'll see here, at least one of these must be true. You have one service-connected disability rated at 60% or more, or you have two or more service-connected disabilities with at least one rated at 40% or more disabling, and a combined rating of 70% or more. And then, so the website makes it look like you need to have these ratings, but you don't. You got to read this last sentence. In certain cases, for example, if you need to be in the hospital often, you may qualify at a lower disability rating. And even that is misleading. You don't have to be in the hospital often. Basically, ignore these rating requirements, because even if you don't have these rating requirements, you can still win TDIU. I've said this before on our channel, we've won cases where veterans have had a single 10% rating, such as for their knee, and we've won TDIU. And so our only standard is you can't work because of your service-connected disabilities. I don't care what the underlying ratings are.
Right.
Those are still winnable TDIU claims.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. TDIU is a rating for some service-connected disability or condition that you have that is preventing you from working. So with that backdrop in mind, let's get into the questions that we're asked all the time. And actually, the question that we are asked really often, maybe the most, is if you have TDIU, is it okay if you earn money from gambling or winning the lottery?
Yes, you can win the lottery, and that will not result in VA taking away your TDIU. VA defines substantially gainful employment, and so you have to actually be working and earning money.
Okay, so scratchers, lotto tickets, those are safe. And if you win, you're not going to get your TDIU removed. Gambling, could that be different?
Sure. The IRS does have a category for professional gamblers. And
Right.
So if you're a professional poker player earning income, definitely that could result in your TDIU being taken away. If you're a hobbyist or casual gambler, no.
So then let's kind of transition into just employment in general. So the reason we did this video was because of the amount of questions we're getting recently recently about what kind of employment you can maintain or have while you're on TDIU. And so I guess let's start with that. Can you work at all while you're receiving TDIU?
I'm going to preface this with you cannot rely on this video as legal advice. I'm going to go over what the regulation says, and you need to make your own decision, and you cannot rely on this video. So I've pulled up here 38 CFR 4.16, which is the regulation for TDIU. And you'll see that VA has this sentence that says marginal employment shall not be considered substantially gainful employment. So if you're on TDIU, you cannot earn substantially gainful employment, but the regulation says marginal employment is not substantially gainful employment. And so reading this regulation, it indicates that you are allowed to engage in marginal employment while you're on TDIU. And the next sentence defines what marginal employment is. So marginal employment generally, this is why you can't rely on this video for legal advice, because there's some wiggle room in here for VA. So it generally shall be deemed to not to exist when a veteran's earned annual income does not exceed the amount established by the U.S. Department of Commerce as a poverty threshold for one person. So what's that saying is that your gross earned income is below the poverty threshold for one person. You're not considered to be working in the eyes of VA, and you can continue to receive your TDIU.
And so the federal poverty guidelines is laid out as varying amounts depending on the size of the household. And so a lot of people read it and think, okay, well, I have 3 dependents. And so I'm looking at the number for 4 in a household, but it's based on a single person regardless of your dependent level, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Does the federal poverty level change? And where do people find those numbers?
Yeah, so you'll want to go to the U.S. Department of Commerce website, and they publish the poverty threshold numbers each year. And yes, they generally do change as inflation goes up every year. It's currently a little bit over $15,000 for 2025. But just go to the website, make sure you're looking at the threshold for a single person, because again, it doesn't matter if you have dependents. The regulation is written just for one person.
So for an example, if somebody has, really debilitating migraines or really debilitating back pain or whatnot, and they are home most of the time because of their pain, but then they have these days where they feel fine and they can go out and they can be productive. So they do Uber driving or something like that, sort of gig employment. For the most part, they would be safe if they're earning $1,000 a month.
Correct.
And they would be able to do that throughout the entire year on days that they feel good, and their TDIU benefits would be safe. In
general, yes.
Okay.
And, just a tag on question that we get a lot is people will often say, well, I'm only working part-time. Therefore, I can keep receiving my TDIU. VA doesn't care how many hours a week you work. They only care about your income. The definition of employment is strictly based on how much you earn.
So if you end up consulting on something and you get these 2 contracts out of the entire year and they're both $10,000, you've earned over the poverty guidelines and your TDIU benefits could be in jeopardy.
Correct.
Which brings me to the next question. There's several people that have called in the past year and talked about how they receive Social Security disability benefits and want to do a work trial, but they're scared because they also get TDIU of doing a work trial and then getting their TDIU removed. Can you talk about that scenario?
Sure. So both the VA and Social Security Administration have methods where veterans or claimants can attempt to return to work, basically test the waters to see if they've improved enough to where they could actually maintain a job. And so you'll see here I pulled up 38 CFR 3.343. If you go down to subsection C and then 2, this talks about VA's test the waters provision for TDIU. And so basically it says if a veteran with a total disability rating for individual unemployability begins to engage in substantially gainful employment, the rating may not be reduced solely on the basis of having secured and followed such substantially gainful occupation unless the veteran maintains the occupation for a period of 12 consecutive months. And so this allows a veteran to test the water, see if they can work. VA will not immediately terminate your TDIU. Before they can terminate TDIU on the basis of you working, it has to be shown that you've maintained that occupation for 12 consecutive months. So you can try it out. You do it for 6 months. You go above the poverty threshold. You realize I cannot work. This is just too difficult. You can stop working. That is going to trigger VA to ask about what you did, because they're going to get notice from Social Security that for those 6 months you went above the poverty threshold, and you'll have to respond to VA and say, hey, I tried to return to work. I only did this for 6 months. I couldn't. You can cite them this regulation and tell them, I didn't do it for 12 months, so please don't terminate my TDIU.
So does the inquiry from VA usually come in the format of a proposed reduction, or is it just simply an inquiry at that point?
It actually usually comes out right as a proposed reduction, and I think they've automated this process. So every year VA cross-checks income with Social Security. Around now is when they'll start sending out notices for 2024. So you'll get a letter in the mail saying, basically, we've noticed that you earned above the poverty threshold for 2024. We are proposing to terminate your TDIU, and then they'll explain your options for responding to that proposal. Generally you have 30 days to request a personal hearing, which you can just do over the phone, and you'll have a chance to talk with VA, and you'll have 60 days to submit additional evidence. So definitely do not ignore that proposal. If you ignore it, they're going to go ahead and terminate TDIU. You do have to respond. And, generally, like you've heard on here before, we always recommend requesting a hearing, because then you'll get, not face to face, because we always do the hearings over the phone, but you'll get to talk directly with the person working on that proposal, and you can explain your situation. And ideally, they should stop the proposal once they understand you didn't work for 12 consecutive months.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, was if no veteran should think, okay, well, I'm not working anymore, so they're going to figure that out and they'll rectify this on their own. You want to take the initiative and say, no, this is what happened.
You have to.
You have to.
Because the only thing VA has is a one-page letter from Social Security saying, this veteran earned $25,000 in 2024. They don't have any context. So you have to respond and explain that to them.
Okay, so you said that you clarify the situation for VA, and they should understand what's going on, and they won't terminate you because you didn't work for 12 consecutive months. What is the deal with jobs that generally aren't full 12-month jobs? For example, teachers that often work 8 or 9 months, and that is their full year.
Yeah. So you need to read the last sentence of this regulation. It says, temporary interruptions in employment, which are of short duration, shall not be considered breaks in otherwise continuous employment. So like you said, teachers, you work 9 months out of the year or 10 months out of the year. You can't say, I only worked 10 months. I didn't do 12 consecutive months. VA is going to consider that type of job a job that's subject to temporary interruptions, and that it's really continuous employment. Another one is like, offshore oil rig. If you're going out for 2 or 3 months at a time and you have a month off, you're not going to be able to use that to say that you didn't do 12 consecutive months.
Okay. Yeah. And similarly, I know there's a lot of jobs. Firefighters in a lot of states get laid off for the entire winter and then rehired. Or if you're in like construction and you work, these big jobs, and then you have months off in between, all of that would be considered just regular course of those types of careers, correct?
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to another type of income that people are curious about, which is passive income. So example is like money that they make from rental properties that they own or co-own, or things like that, dividends. How does that income impact TDIU?
Yeah, it gets more into a gray area, and these questions I feel like arise often in like rental income and investment income. If you're a day trader and you're trading 8 hours a day and you're earning income from that, VA is probably going to consider that to be employment. If you just have an investment and you collect dividends and you make a few stock trades a year or even a month, and you're investing your retirement money or something, that's not going to be considered employment. Rental income, I would say, is even more of a gray area. VA is going to want to know the details, like, do you have 100 properties and, you're spending 30 hours a week, doing things related to managing those properties? They're probably going to consider that to be a form of employment. Whereas if, you had one rental house and the only work you do on it is signing a new lease for a tenant once a year, that's probably not going to be considered substantially gainful employment. And so it's really fact specific as to how much you're actually working on it and if it's truly passive income or not.
If you co-own rental properties with, let's say, your spouse, and they really are the ones that handle all of that, would you be on the hook for losing your TDIU benefits if it's really their income?
No. And again, you're going to have to, if VA proposes to terminate TDIU, you're going to have to explain it. My wife and I are co-owners of this business, but I don't do anything. She does all the work. I've gotten questions. People have been like, well, I have this business, but I could put it under my wife's name. That's fraud. If you're doing the work, you can't just put it under someone else's name and be like, oh, it's not my business. I'm not doing it. They're looking at the facts. What are you doing in the business?
TDIU is a rating based on your inability to work.
Right.
So if you are in fact able to work, then it's not an appropriate rating for you, which brings me to the next question. How does volunteer work impact anything? So there are several people who I've spoken to who volunteer their time and or services, and it's really cathartic and therapeutic for them, these various, organizations that they are part of. And they're concerned that their ability to give themselves to these organizations will look poorly on their employability status. What are your thoughts on that?
I have two thoughts. One, doing volunteer work is not going to trigger VA to propose to terminate TDIU because there's no income, so they're not going to get any notice from Social Security that you're doing volunteer work. So it's generally a non-issue. And two, being able to do volunteer work, in my opinion, does not translate to being able to maintain substantially gainful employment. Volunteer work, you can quit at any time. You can not work a day or not volunteer a day. And so I think it's a very low risk area.
And it does come up, I feel like, more when people are questioning whether they should go for TDIU and they're concerned about it coming up in a CMP exam, and they don't know if they should be truthful about it because they're worried that people are going to think, oh, well, if you can volunteer your time every Friday to, go down to the juvie and talk to these kids, why couldn't you work?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think CMP examiners ask about volunteer work.
Ask about that stuff. Okay.
They're asking about if you work.
All right, getting near the end of my notes here, but something that does come up a lot, and I've waited to the end to talk about it, is sheltered employment. Many people feel like if they are working at a family business, there's so much more tolerance for behaviors that wouldn't be otherwise tolerated, and they want to know whether or not their specific circumstances would qualify for sheltered employment, even though they're making above or well above the poverty guidelines.
Yeah. So, there's been recent updates to sheltered employment, and you can see here we're in the TDIU regulation 4.16A, and this continues the definition of marginal employment. And this is a sentence about sheltered or protected work environments. And basically, if you can show you're in a sheltered or protected work environment, you can earn above the poverty threshold and still receive TDIU. However, how we've talked in a different video about the Labruza case that came out recently, and this case made it so that there is now an income component to protected work environments. And put simply, if you earn too much, even if you're in an otherwise traditional protected work environment, you still cannot get TDIU. And we don't know what too much is. The court said that you have to be in a low income position, but they didn't define what a low income position. In the Labruza case, the veteran was making around $200,000 a year. So we know that anything $200,000 and above is not a low income position, which seems pretty obvious. But we don't have a bright line rule of what a low income position is. The court suggested some tagging it to like what the income limit is for doing VA copays for healthcare, which is around $20,000 a year. My personal opinion is a low income position is probably somewhere between, the poverty threshold of 15,000, maybe up to 25, 30,000. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's higher. Maybe you could argue that you're in a high cost of living area. And so a low income position in New York City could earn more than a low income position in rural Alabama. I don't know. It's unknown at this point. But, once you get probably into like $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, you're probably not in a low income position. But it remains to be seen. I suspect one day there will be a bright line rule. So if you earn too much, you're not going to be able to make the protected work environment argument.
Okay, last couple questions. A lot of folks want to know if they have a duty to report their income to the VA, and if they do, how they go about doing that.
I tend to be of the opinion that VA is going to get the notice from Social Security. Again, this is not legal advice, so generally I'd say just wait for VA to get notice from Social Security that you've earned, and VA will then propose it. Especially because we've had situations where vets have told VA, hey, I started working, and VA immediately proposes to terminate it, even though it hasn't been 12 months. Maybe if you have maintained it for 12 months and you know you're going to keep maintaining it, at that point you may want to report it to VA, like, hey, I started working, been able to do this for 12 months, and I intend to keep working, just to get ahead of the curve, and VA can start the process to stop the TDIU.
This question was asked recently. Someone wanting to know if school attendance or using the GI Bill is a red flag for TDIU review.
So going to school and receiving the GI Bill is not going to trigger VA to review your TDIU. The only thing that's going to trigger that is the Social Security scan and you earning income. And GI Bill is not reported as income because it's not income, so it's not going to trigger that scan.
Okay, which leads me to my next question, which is how often does VA reevaluate TDIU cases? Is it solely based on income that they're getting from the IRS or Social Security? Or is it just sort of randomly based on the conditions that various veterans have?
99% of the time, it's based on Social Security telling VA that you've earned income. However, if you have other claims going on, there is the possibility that the VA rater could see something in an examination. The examiner says, oh, this veteran could absolutely work. That could trigger VA to look at TDIU and try and propose to terminate it. It's pretty rare. And so that's why we always say if you're already receiving the maximum benefit from VA, we don't recommend making new claims. You don't want to keep them involved in your file because things like that can happen.
Okay, my last question, and this is one of the most commonly asked questions, is we get veterans who are afraid to apply for TDIU because they feel like receiving the benefit is somehow going to prevent them from returning to work if and when they're able, or it puts some kind of like prohibition on their ability to work. So can you just talk about that briefly as we wrap up?
Yeah, so it's true. A lot of vets think, once you're granted TDIU, that's VA saying that you can never work again. And that is not true. The TDIU is your rating. And so once you have it, if later on in your life things improve and you can work, you're allowed to do that. As we just discussed in this video, the regulation has a whole return to work procedure. So yeah, if you improve and you can work, you can absolutely go back to work, and VA will eventually terminate the TDIU and resume paying you at the payment level consistent with your combined rating.
So just for anyone out there that has that fear or that loves to work but is temporarily unable to, TDIU is a tool for you, and it's supposed to work to help you during this time. But if the future has you able to work, then that's great. TDIU can end and you can go back to work. So they're separate things, and it's based on your ability to work. All right, those are all the questions I have. Is there anything else in your mind that you recall vets asking a lot that we should address before we end this?
Just the biggest thing is these rating requirements. People think you're not eligible. You're always eligible to apply for TDIU. I don't care what your rating is. If you believe you can't work due to your service-connected disabilities, that's it. Don't worry about the ratings. Apply for it.
That's all we've got for you today. Thanks for joining us. If you have any specific questions about TDIU or your circumstances, feel free to leave them in the comments. We're shooting a video next where we just go through and answer comments that folks have left or questions that folks have left. So always feel free to do that, and we will either answer them in text or in a video.
Appreciate you guys for watching this far. Make sure to like and subscribe.
Bye.